Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lewis Miller. Our guest today is Canadian anthropologist, author, and political activist, Dr. Jeremy Narby. Jeremy has been supporting Indigenous people in the Peruvian Amazon for decades. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Cosmic Serpent, as well as Intelligence in Nature, Shamans Through Time, The Psychotropic Mind, and a documentary film that you ought to see called Night of the Liana. Jeremy, his quest has been to integrate scientific thought with the wisdom and knowledge of Indigenous shaman, and also to teach us that intelligence is not exclusive to human beings. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Richard.
Where shall we begin? What interests me, we're going to talk today, of course, about your book, Plant Teachers. But what I wanted to begin with for a bit is about intelligence in other than human beings. I'm fascinated by some of the things that you've commented on, particularly prairie dogs, because I'm a great lover of canines.
Well, it's a somewhat tricky subject, but that just makes it more interesting. Western cultures, and by this I mean people who speak English, French, German, Spanish, so North Americans, Canadians, people globally in Western culture, come out of a tradition, a humanist tradition, that has put humans above all other species for centuries. And intelligence was conceived by European thinkers. I mean, intelligence is a Latin word, interlegere, to choose between. That's what the etymology of the word is. And European thinkers have considered that it was one of humanity's numerous specificities. Only humans had intelligence. Only humans had mind. Only humans had a long shopping list of things, supposedly, and intelligence was one of them. It would be too long to go into just why Western people had this proclivity of putting themselves above all other species in this way. We were supposed to be the only subjects, and all the rest were objects, and so on. So intelligence was on the shopping list of what was supposed to be our specificity. We had the monopoly on it, supposedly. It was supposed to be one of our treasures, what made us human. And so then philosophers and other thinkers went on to squabble for centuries over the definition of this precious thing that was intelligence. And there are about 70 different definitions of intelligence, the overwhelming majority of which are in exclusively human terms. So if you're strict with words, it's very difficult to apply the concept to other species because by definition, it is conceived of in exclusively human terms. Well, interestingly enough, nature is another Western concept that also has a similar kind of opposition. Nature is everything that culture is not, and culture is everything that nature is not. If you look in the dictionary, the definition of nature is the phenomena of the physical world, including plants, animals, and the landscape, in opposition to humans and human creations. So in these very Western concepts, such as intelligence and nature, we have, if you unpack the bag, the luggage of these concepts, you have this dichotomy between humans on the one hand and all the rest on the other. And in fact, intelligence in nature is a contradiction in terms, if one looks at it like that, because intelligence excludes all the non-humans, and nature excludes the humans. And this is just by definition. And I can give an easy example of this. So before getting to prairie dogs, I'll start with slime molds. So these are, single cells of slime that can actually grow as big as a human hand, but that's another matter. And Japanese scientists discovered right at the beginning of the 21st century that if you put one of these organisms in a small maze, that they could shrink their body down to form a tube that would span the shortest distance between the entrance and the exit of the maze, and therefore could solve a maze. Well, solving a maze was supposed to be proof of intelligence in tests that scientists used to do on this. So when the Japanese scientist Toshiyuki Nakagaki published his results of a single cell of slime solving a maze, he used the word intelligence to describe what the organism had managed to do, to describe its behavior. And then he found that there were two reactions to his publication. Japanese journalists wanted to know how the slime had solved the maze. Western journalists mainly questioned whether the word intelligence was appropriate to apply to a single cell of slime. I think at the beginning of the 21st century, Western thinkers and journalists were starting to feel okay with applying intelligence to large vertebrates like chimpanzees and so forth, but certainly not to a single cell of slime. Well, in Japanese, if you look in the dictionary under intelligence, how do you say intelligence in Japanese? The word is chi-sei, and it means capacity to know. Well, the Japanese people think it is just obvious that all living organisms have a capacity to know. So they don't question the fact that a slime mold can solve the maze and uses its capacity to know to do so. Well, Japanese people come out of a Shintoist animist culture. There has never been that tendency to make an absolute distinction between humans on the one hand and all the rest on the other. But not us Westerners. And it's true that the word intelligence has been used so often in a way that is applied exclusively to humans that it's very difficult to apply it to other organisms, especially when they're lowly organisms like a slime mold. So what that little story shows is that we have a problem with our concepts. Because, and when I say we, I mean Western people speaking Western languages with words like intelligence that have centuries worth of baggage that make it very difficult to apply to other species. So actually, it's not that other species lack intelligence, but that our own concepts do. And at this point, there are so many different definitions of intelligence that it's probably not very intelligent to come up with another one.
Jeremy, why is this important? Why does it matter that we define in Western culture intelligence as something specific to human beings and not to trees, not to prairie dogs, not to Rupert Sheldrake's dogs that know when people are coming a mile away? You know, why is this important? We're talking about, you say that philosophers have been discussing this for a couple of hundred years. And so many people would say, so what? That's what philosophers like to do. They like to pick apart a concept for a couple of hundred years. But how does that affect our lives, this definitional system? Why should we care about this?
Well, if you presuppose that the slime mold is just a bunch of stupid slime, you're probably not going to look at it much further. But if you consider that it actually does have a capacity to know just like we do, then you'll take the step of taking it a bit more seriously. And lo and behold, what did they discover, just in the case of the slime mold, that when you put it in a complex terrain, and then you get it to choose the fastest or most economical routes from one place to another, it comes up with solutions that are just as elegant as the Tokyo subway. In other words, these organisms, using their capacity to know, have come up with all kinds of interesting solutions to problems that we also face. So there's a whole domain that is opened up of biomimicry, of studying what other organisms do to inspire ourselves from their solutions. So that's just a very pragmatic and concrete thing. But more broadly, and I'd say almost like philosophically, you can wander around and consider that all the other beings in the world, apart from humans, are just stupid objects. Your lawn is stupid, the trees are stupid, the slime molds are stupid, the ants are stupid, everybody's stupid, and we're the only intelligent ones. Hey. And actually, our legal systems, for the moment, more or less look at things that way. In other words, most legal systems consider plants and animals as objects, and humans are the only subjects. So that's essentially the world we live in right now. It's kind of a lonely world. I mean, it denies so many things that these other species do. So it doesn't really fit the data. And it's somewhat lonely. I mean, what is the joy of discounting all living beings except humans and denying all the capacities that they do have and insisting that they are just stupid objects? What is, so I'm returning the question. In other words, it's not so what, but I mean, what is so cool about looking at the world that way?
Well, more and more of us have come to realize that trees not only talk to one another, but they actually take action based on their interaction with one another. They march. The trees march, as you know, towards water. And you can see the march if you look at landscapes. And we know that. And I referenced Rupert's work with the dogs, knowing that the people the owners are coming home from a mile away. And so there is certainly, and of course, Steinmetz's work with mushrooms, and we're learning that mycelium are talking to each other all over the world and may in fact have a hairnet that's covering the entire planet. So we are learning that, which is lovely for communication for many of us, so that when we go out in nature, we have a sense that we're communicating with everything around us, not just the people that we're walking with on the trail. So if that's what you mean by the practical implications, then I understand where you're coming from and what you're saying, why this is important. It has implications, doesn't it, for how we care for our fellow beings called nature?
Well, that's right. You see, one thing is recognizing the kinship that science has now been able to even put numbers on. Like we have 99% DNA correspondence with chimpanzees and so forth. The physicochemical kinship that we have with nature is undeniable. And the other thing is, by considering plants and animals as beings like us rather than as objects devoid of intention and intelligence, it opens up the possibility of relating with them, having relations with our relatives. Whereas if you insist on objectifying the world and considering it as just a big bunch of objects, it's much more difficult to relate to the world. It's a lot more easy to exploit it at all levels. And I think that's been one of the upsides, if you wish, of this way of looking at the world. It's made it very easy for human beings just to go ahead and exploit it and accumulate wealth, and not relate to it, as if the whole thing was just a bunch of objects for us to exploit. But considering plants and animals as intelligent beings like ourselves, it's not only what they truly are, it also opens up the possibility of identifying with them, having compassion for them, taking their point of view into consideration, developing relations with them, reconnecting with the living world, and finding our place in that world. In other words, coming down, once we come down from the pedestal on which we have put ourselves in Western culture above all the other species, once you come down from the pedestal, well, then the time comes to start working on having relations with these beings. And I think that's about where we're at right now. And so recognizing their capacities, their talents, their intelligence, their capacity to know, as the Japanese would say, all this is part of recovering from the almost like the frigidity of humanist objectivism, where, I mean, it was kind of lonely up on that pedestal where we thought, and you see, if you take the shopping list I was talking about, this long list of things that Western thinkers have said we were the only ones to do, like entertain abstract thoughts. Well, this has been falsified. I mean, bees can handle abstract concepts, and they have brains the size of a grain of salt. So, and this has been demonstrated in a lab. We were supposed to be the only ones who used tools. Well, it turns out all kinds of animals use tools. And on, the long list of so-called human specificities has been melting like snow in the sun. And it turns out that, well, what Darwin actually told us, we evolved and we're part of this whole biospheric life, and we're members of the same family as all these plants and animals. And so, we got to get used to it.
So you're teaching us, Jeremy, if I understand correctly, plants and nature have intelligence. You're showing us that we can actually have a relationship with nature similar to ways in which we relate to one another. And you're now taking the position that plants can be teachers. And we're going to segue now into your book, Plant Teachers. And I'd like to talk about your work with nicotine and ayahuasca as teachers to humanity. So let's talk first about nicotine and how you got involved with nicotine and the differentiation between what you're talking about as nicotine and what we commonly refer to as nicotine in Western culture, which is something that's inside of commercially made cigarettes.
Okay. Well, first, I'd like to be clear that I am not affirming that there is intelligence in nature. I am affirming that there are problems with the concept of intelligence, and that it's very difficult to apply it to other species. And that in a Western language like English, we have an absence of concepts to be able to deal with what is there. Because if it's not intelligence, then there's something else going on. There's a capacity to know, a capacity to make decisions, a capacity to learn, but then, and even a capacity to behave. But each word, like with plants, we run into problems with words as soon as we use them. For example, the definition of behavior is to move. The movement is part of, it's difficult to have behavior if you don't have movement. And so when botanists talked about plant behavior, they got criticized because you can't really apply the word behavior to a plant because plants don't move. So that was the problem. Turns out plants do move. They just move a lot more slowly. Yes. When botanists talked about plant cognition, people said, wait a second, you can't talk about cognition because they don't have brains. Well, it's true that plants don't have brains. And so we define cognition as necessarily implying the presence of brains. Okay, so we can't use the word cognition, we can't use the word behavior, we can't use the word intelligence, and yet, when you look at what plants do, they seem to be doing things that would imply something like a capacity to cognize the world and so forth. So before rushing up to the barricades and affirming that plants have cognition and plants do this and the other, I think the important thing is to rush up to the barricades and say, we have a problem with our concepts because plants are doing all kinds of things and our concepts have these limits. Now, the same thing with plant teachers. Plant teachers is obviously a concept that would send your average Western thinker up the wall. In other words, it's way too animist. Plants don't teach. What are we talking about? This is crazy stuff. But actually, you said I was a political activist. I have been working all my life to back the initiatives of indigenous Amazonian people and also to try to act as a kind of a intermediary and help make their way of understanding the world, their systems of knowledge, understandable. Well, these are people who consider plants like tobacco and like ayahuasca as teachers. From their point of view, what this means is that these are powerful psychoactive plants that when you ingest, the effect that they have on your body and on your mind, among other things, can lead you to new perspectives, new understandings. In other words, you learn from the experience. And the way that they interpret this is that this plant is a powerful teacher. And that's all they're saying. They're also saying that plants in general have something like a personality, that each species has a kind of intention. And this is where the words, once again, get difficult. That there is something like an energy, an intelligence, a personality that goes with each species. And tobacco is different from ayahuasca. And when you interact with this plant, it has its own kind of signature or impact on your personality. And that's one way of, it's not necessarily necessary to believe that a plant has a personality, but you can certainly ingest it and experience the impact that it has on your personality. What I'm trying to do as an anthropologist is say, look, here are two powerful Amazonian plants that are now consumed around the world. One is tobacco. It has more than 1 billion users, 1 billion daily users around the world. Another is ayahuasca. It has maybe 1,000 times less users, but it's been talked about a lot recently. Indigenous people in the Amazon, where these plants come from, have a long experience working with these plants. They say they're powerful, they're dangerous, they can teach you things, but they can also mislead you. And they certainly personify them. In other words, they don't just consider them to be bags of molecules. They don't deny that these plants contain substances, but they say there's more to these plants than just the substances they contain. And they consider them like us, like people, as if the plants had a point of view, had a personality, and when you interact with these plants by ingesting them, that they teach you things. So I think that it is interesting for Western people, including scientists who are interested in these powerful plants, to consider the indigenous point of view on the question. You don't have to subscribe to it or believe in it, but you can become aware of it. And I think it's a point of view that is fairly complementary to what science can tell us about these plants. You were talking about nicotine. It's true. I try to focus, like Amazonian people do, on the plant rather than on the specific molecules that the plants contain. But as a Westerner, I'm also interested in science, and I think it's important to know about the molecules that the plants contain. I'd just like to say on this question as to, so a scientist would look at a plant at like a kind of a bag of molecules. And the indigenous Amazonian will look at a plant as a sentient being with a personality. So these seem to be two fairly distinct approaches. But when it comes to a human being, I am also a bag of molecules. It's true. I'm a bag of flesh. And you take a knife and you cut the flesh bag and blood comes out. It really is true that I'm a walking flesh bag, but I'm also more than that. I'm a person. I have a point of view. I have intention. Well, in the Amazonian point of view, that's how it is with plants as well. Yes, they are bags of molecules, but they are also sentient beings. There is not a contradiction between those two points of view.
Western science would say that to attribute those characteristics to a plant is anthropomorphizing the plant, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That is correct. The trouble is that if you are an anthropos, a human, you can only use human concepts to understand whatever there is in the world. I mean, you necessarily use human concepts to understand the world. So that would be one thing to say.
Yeah, it's a way of saying, since we're up on the pedestal and we're the only ones that have this particular characteristics, when something else shows those characteristics, what we're doing is attributing human characteristics to them rather than recognizing they may have their own characteristics.
Well, it's true. If we could speak something other than a human language, if we could understand the language of plants. I mean, plants speak in chemicals mainly. If you look at how plants communicate with one another, it's not sounds coming out of their mouths. They don't have mouths, but it's with chemicals that they kind of squirt at each other or send up in the air or send down in the mycelium. There's all kinds of exchanges and communication going on, and we're only just starting to understand it. And it's true that if we could speak outside of human concepts and language, then we would be less constrained by human concepts and language. But still, I don't think that anthropomorphizing is an obstacle. It's it's unavoidable. That's the thing. So what are we going to do? We're going to say, oh, well, we can't talk about them really, because if we did, we'd be using human words. Well, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, we only have human words, and so, and once you have empathy with another being, let's say a plant, well, you are condemned to your human concepts. But I think it's preferable to try to understand the plant's point of view, even if one does have a tendency to anthropomorphize, simply because it's better than nothing.
Well, in a way, from what you're saying, it sounds to me like to anthropomorphize a plant would be insulting, It would be like, meeting a person from another country and only being willing to relate to them in terms of the country that you came from, taking into no consideration whatsoever their culture, their language, and what country they're from.
Yes,
Everything has to be right.
yes,
Sort of
but
what America does in a way, which is judge the entire world based on what we are here in America.
well, see, I think that we're coming. When I say we, I mean Western people. We're coming from a long way out. We've got a lot of ground to sort of catch up, and so we have presumed that all other species didn't have a point of view. This is when Amazonian people say that there's a person inside the plant, a person like us. And that is the heart of the shamanic approach. What they're saying is there's somebody home in there that has a point of view. And philosophers talk about this. How do you actually define? So, what is a person? It's actually something quite difficult to define. By some definitions, a person is an entity that has a point of view. So, and this is not, I don't think that this is anthropomorphizing. The opening one's mind to the idea that, for example, a blade of grass might have a point of view. And so it may sound like anthropomorphism because I'm saying, okay, it means there's a person inside. So I'm projecting a person in that blade of grass. No, I'm considering that blade of grass is a sentient being, and like myself, it aspires to live. And this can be ascertained by just observing it. It makes all kinds of decisions. It takes actions to thrive. And actually, I do the same, or at least I try to when I wake up in the morning. So that conceiving that there's someone home rather than nobody home, and that somebody who is home inside of the blade of grass has a point of view, and that point of view includes looking out for number one, in other words, me, the blade of grass. And so it wants to have sunlight, it wants to have food. I mean, it wants its place in the sun, just like you and me. Is this anthropomorphism? No, I think it has to do with simply considering that a blade of grass is more than just an object, that it actually is a sentient being. And like all living sentient beings, it aspires to live.
If we take a look at human beings, we see that there are characteristics that are shared, and there are characteristics which are idiosyncratic to individual people. Can you say the same about ayahuasca and tobacco, Amazonian tobacco?
Well, actually, thank you for the question, because it really is going to make us advance in this discussion. Botanists have pointed out that plants are not really individuals, because the word individual means undividable. An individual is somebody, this is what the word means. It cannot be divided. If I cut you in two, you're finished. Plants are dividuals. They can be divided. And so you cut the plant, and it becomes two plants. Plants have this thing about them. You cut a tree, and then all kinds of little trees grow out of the roots. So here we are animals, and as animals we are individuals. There are some animals that you can cut in two and they become two animals, like worms, but they're rare. The overwhelming majority of animals They move around to feed themselves, and they get a lot of their food from plants, in fact. And they are individuals. And so we don't only have human concepts, we have animal concepts. Like the idea that behavior necessarily implies movement is a very animal concept. The idea that a consciousness must somehow be individual is also a very animal concept. So here we are, we're stuck inside of our animal bodies with our animal concepts, and we're trying to start to understand plants and their points of view or their intelligence or their capacities or just who they are. We can see how they keep showing the limits of our own concepts, which is interesting, but still moving beyond the consideration of the limits of our own concepts. So we got to start thinking about, well, so how do plants see things? Well, that involves thinking, what does it mean when you are not an individual? How does I really do think of the world as an individual. In other words, I'm forever thinking inside my own head about, the books, or, I dialogue with other people and so forth. But, I spend my life focused as an individual. But plants clearly don't do that. And I have really yet to imagine the full implications of what it means to be individuals. So that it's like we're in kindergarten when it comes to understanding who plants are, what plants are. Not only do we have to rethink many of our concepts, but it's difficult for us to expand our animal minds and start thinking in the way that plants think. Trees are forever exchanging nutritious elements. They're being called the communists of the natural world. There's all kinds of things going on in the vegetal world that we're only just coming to realize. And there are also selfish plants that poison the ground around them so only they can grow, like eucalyptus. There's carnivorous plants. There's just like there's all kinds of individuals among humans. It's true that there are all kinds of plants, and some of them are not very nice. In fact, my co-author Rafael Chanchari, in our book Plant Teachers, points to the fact that all the plants that people in the Amazon consider to be teachers and that scientists would consider to be psychoactive are ambiguous. They're not necessarily benevolent. They can teach you things, but they can also harm you and mislead you. So there's all kinds of thinking that needs to be and research that needs to be done for us to really start understanding what plants are up to and who they are.
One of the very important things it sounds like you're bringing to us, Jeremy, are the limitations of our languaging system, of what we have developed in making these grunts and sounds that we decode and call words to describe things in the world. And it sounds like what you're bringing to us is that our grunts are still somewhat, they're limiting, they're obfuscating, they're still basically grunts in various areas.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's what you say is very pertinent, but I would add to it. Clearly, human language is fantastic. It seems weird to write books and then to trash human language. There's something miraculous about a book where you choose these words. They're not even grunts. They're ink on paper at this point. And you can share what's in your mind with lots of other people. And they actually get the message. There's something really very magical about human language and human communications. But what I'd add, I agree entirely with what you said before. But I think what I'd add to it is that where we get into trouble is that our language is so powerful and so magical that we don't see its limits. And its limits are precisely that our words tend to have baggage that we don't see, and they carry around the presuppositions of our culture. So if our culture has said, for example, humans are the only ones who are intelligent, and so a concept like nature is everything that is not human. Well, it's true. This is a kind of a grunty concept by people who are on a pedestal. But then we don't realize that because we're inside that culture. And then we go around and we say, oh, I love nature. I'm a friend of nature. And we just use the word. And it's true. At this point, the word has some serious limits. I mean, the word nature presupposes a fundamental